Tony Valdez had a reputation for doing the impossible. He could make a stubborn alpha fall in love with his accountant, convince two socialites who had publicly despised each other for years to get married, and somehow turn disastrous first dates into lifelong relationships. What Tony couldn't do was understand why the most feared alpha in the city had requested him personally. He found out when Matteo Ramirez walked into his office. Tony looked up from his laptop. For a moment, neither man spoke. Matteo was taller than Tony had expected, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. Two men followed him into the reception area before stopping outside the office. Mafia security. Tony had dealt with powerful clients before. He simply hadn't dealt with one who arrived looking like he could buy the building and everyone inside it before lunch. Matteo extended his hand. Tony Valdez. Tony looked at his hand, then at him. Matteo Ramirez. A faint smile appeared on Matteo's face. You know who I am. I make a living knowing who people are. Tony shook his hand. The contact lasted barely a second. Still, something about it registered. Warm. Steady. Unexpectedly pleasant. Tony released him first. Sit. Matteo raised an eyebrow. Most people probably didn't tell him what to do. Tony gestured toward the chair. Unless you would prefer to conduct your matchmaking consultation standing. Matteo sat. Tony returned to his desk. Let's start simple. Why are you here? I need a partner. Tony glanced at the file his assistant had prepared. Marriage? Eventually. Eventually isn't very specific. I want someone suitable. Tony smiled faintly. Everyone says that. What do you need to know? Everything. Matteo leaned back. I'm 34. I'm an alpha. I run several businesses. Tony looked at him. Businesses? Matteo's expression didn't change. Tony smiled. Right. Well, call them businesses. That earned him another small smile. Then Matteo's eyes narrowed slightly. You're an enigma. Tony leaned back in his chair. That tends to happen when one is born an enigma. For the first time, Matteo looked genuinely intrigued. Most enigmas I've met aren't this calm. Most alphas you've met probably expected people to be impressed by them. Silence. Tony let the words settle between them. Matteo didn't look offended. If anything, he looked amused. Perhaps. Tony picked up his pen. Now tell me what you're actually looking for. Matteo's amusement faded into something more thoughtful. I work long hours, Matteo continued. My schedule is unpredictable. My family is complicated. My reputation isn't exactly ordinary. Understatement. I need someone who can handle that. Tony made a note. Anything else? Matteo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I don't want someone who loves my money. Tony looked up. Good. Because I don't match people based on bank accounts. Their eyes met. For the first time, something shifted between them. Not attraction exactly. Curiosity. Tony found himself wondering what Matteo looked like when he wasn't surrounded by guards and people waiting for his approval. He immediately dismissed the thought. I am going to need honesty from you, Tony said. You will have it. Even when the truth makes you look bad? Especially then. Tony studied him. That answer, at least, sounded sincere. He closed the file. I will find you someone. Matteo stood. At the door, he paused. And if you can't? Tony looked up. Then I will tell you. Matteo held his gaze for another second. I am looking forward to seeing what you come up with, Tony. Then he left. Tony waited until the door closed. Only then did he look down at the file again. Matteo Ramirez. He had a feeling this particular client was going to be trouble. He just didn't know yet what kind. Tony believed matchmaking was less about finding someone attractive and more about discovering what a person actually needed. That was why his first meeting with every client was always the same. No distractions. Pure honesty. Matteo Ramirez sat across from him the following afternoon, looking considerably less intimidating without the entourage. Tony slid a folder across the desk. "These are my rules." Matteo opened it. "Rules?" "7 of them. I thought you were supposed to be matching me." "I am. And if you want me to succeed, you'll follow my process." Matteo glanced down the page. "Rule 1? No lying. Reasonable. Rule 2, you don't reject someone based on superficial details." Matteo looked at him. "What counts as superficial? Height, wealth, family name, social status?" Matteo nodded. "Rule 3, you meet every serious candidate at least once." "That sounds tedious." "It is." A faint smile appeared. Tony continued. "Rule 4, you don't compare them to your previous relationships." Matteo's expression changed slightly. "You've been researching me." "I research everyone." "Should I be concerned?" "Only if you've done something interesting." Matteo laughed quietly. Tony tried not to notice how different he looked when he did. "Rule 5, Tony said. You tell me what you actually want." "I already did." "No. You told me what you think sounds appropriate." Matteo stared at him. Tony held his gaze. "That distinction is important." For several seconds neither spoke. Then Matteo closed the folder. "What do you think I want?" Tony smiled. "That isn't my job to answer." That evening, Tony's office disappeared behind him. His apartment was nothing like his professional world. It was warm, lived in, and filled with books, plants, expensive candles, and clothes he had abandoned wherever he had last taken them off. His best friend, Nico, was already sitting on the kitchen counter when Tony walked in. "You're late." "I had a client." "The terrifying Alpha?" Tony stopped. "You know, sometimes I regret telling you things." Nico grinned. "You're interested." "I am working." "That's not what I said." Tony opened the refrigerator. "I am not interested in my clients." "Sure." Before Tony could answer, his phone buzzed. A message from someone he had been casually seeing. "Come over tonight?" Tony stared at the screen for a moment. He typed a reply. "I will come by later." He set the phone down. For tonight, Matteo Ramirez could remain exactly what he was supposed to be. A client. Jake's place was familiar enough. Low lights, the faint scent of cologne, and whatever takeout he had ordered earlier. No small talk beyond a quick "Hey" at the door. Clothes came off in a trail from the entryway to the bedroom. By the way, this story has an uncensored version with exclusive intimate scenes not available on YouTube. Be sure to join my Patreon to watch the uncensored cut and unlock exclusive BL stories. Now, let's get back to the story. His mind flickered, unbidden, to Matteo. The low laugh in the office. The way those dark eyes had held his. Just a second. Then Tony shook his head sharply, banishing it. Just a client, he reminded himself. Nothing more. Across the city, Matteo stood alone in the enormous kitchen of his penthouse. There were 12 bedrooms. 3 kitchens. A private elevator. A view that stretched across the entire city. And absolutely nobody waiting for him. His phone sat untouched on the counter. His usual evenings were filled with meetings, dinners, negotiations, and people who wanted something from him. But lately, the silence bothered him. He poured himself a drink and looked toward the empty dining table. He didn't need someone to cook for him. Or manage his house. He didn't need another person impressed by his name. He wanted someone who would sit across from him after a long day and ask how he was. Someone who would know when he was angry and when he was simply tired. Someone who would stay because they wanted to. His thoughts drifted unexpectedly to Tony. The calm enigma behind the marble desk. The man who had looked at Matteo's reputation and somehow seen nothing worth fearing. Matteo smiled faintly. He wondered what Tony was doing tonight. Then he caught himself. He had hired the man to find him a partner. Not to become one. At least, that was what Matteo told himself. Tony Valdez had spent 3 days choosing Matteo Ramirez's first serious candidate. He wanted someone who could actually tolerate Matteo. That, Tony suspected, was going to be the difficult part. "This is Daniel Cruz," Tony said as the man entered the private lounge. 32. Financial consultant. Speaks 3 languages, owns his own company, and has absolutely no interest in becoming anyone's trophy. Daniel smiled. "It's nice to meet you." Matteo stood and shook his hand. "Likewise." Tony watched carefully. Matteo was polite. Perfectly polite. He asked Daniel about his work, his interests, his family, his expectations for a relationship. Daniel answered easily. There was no arrogance, no nervousness, no obvious incompatibility. Tony felt a small amount of relief. Finally, a normal meeting. He poured himself some water and glanced toward them. Daniel was talking about traveling. Matteo nodded. Tony listened for a moment, then his phone buzzed. He looked down. A message from Nico. "Dinner tonight? And don't bring the Mafia boss." Tony smiled despite himself. "What?" Daniel was looking at him. "Nothing." "You smiled." "My friend." Daniel grinned. "Someone special?" Tony shook his head. "No." Across the room, Matteo's eyes briefly settled on Tony's phone. Then on Tony's face. The look disappeared almost immediately. Tony didn't notice. The conversation continued. Daniel turned toward Matteo. "So, what do you actually want from a relationship?" Matteo was quiet. Tony looked up. It was a good question. "I want peace," Matteo finally said. Daniel's expression softened. "That's a good answer." Matteo nodded. But his eyes had moved again. Straight toward Tony. Tony caught it this time. For half a second, their gazes locked. Then Matteo looked back at Daniel. Tony frowned slightly. Interesting. An hour later, Daniel left with a pleasant smile and a promise that Tony would contact him. The door closed. Tony picked up his tablet. "Well?" Matteo loosened his cuff. "No." Tony stopped. "No? He's not right for me." Tony stared at him. "Why?" "Good man." "That wasn't the question." Matteo looked at him. "He isn't you." Tony's fingers went still. There it was again. That strange feeling. That subtle shift whenever Matteo looked at him for too long. Tony set the tablet down. "You spent the last hour talking to Daniel." "Yes." "And?" Matteo's mouth curved slightly. "I was watching you." Tony's heartbeat stumbled. "You're making my job difficult." "I am beginning to think that's not an accident." Tony gave him a warning look. "Matteo." "What?" "You hired me to find you a partner." "I know. So let me do my job." Matteo stood and adjusted his jacket. "Fine." Tony watched him walk toward the door. At the threshold, Matteo turned. "Find me another one." Tony raised an eyebrow. "Another candidate?" Matteo smiled. "No." He paused. "Another reason to come back." Then he left. Tony remained standing in the middle of the room, staring at the closed door. For the first time, he wondered whether finding Matteo a partner was actually the wrong job for him. Because Matteo wasn't looking for someone else. He was looking at Tony. By the fourth candidate, Tony Valdez had stopped pretending he wasn't irritated. "This is ridiculous." Matteo Ramirez looked up from the folder in his hands. "What is?" "You." Tony dropped the folder onto the desk. "You've rejected 4 perfectly suitable people." 3. 4. The second candidate was never suitable. He was a surgeon. He talked about himself for 40 minutes. "You asked him questions?" "I was being polite." Tony stared at him. "You're annoying." Matteo's mouth curved. "And yet you keep seeing me." "Because you're paying me." "Is that the only reason?" Tony ignored the question. "This afternoon's candidate is different." Matteo opened the folder. "Her name is Sophia. She owns her own company, has a strong personality, understands your schedule, and has absolutely no interest in your money. Sounds promising. Tony narrowed his eyes. Try. I always try. You don't. I do. You rejected Daniel because you were watching me. Silence. Tony immediately regretted saying it. Matteo slowly placed the folder down. Did you notice? Unfortunately. I thought you weren't paying attention. I pay attention to everything. That answer landed differently. Tony looked away first. Just meet Sophia. I will. And don't find some ridiculous reason to reject her. I will be honest. That is exactly what I'm afraid of. The meeting went surprisingly well. Sophia was confident, intelligent, and completely comfortable around Matteo. She didn't care about his reputation. She challenged him twice during dinner. Matteo actually laughed. Tony watched from across the table and felt something unexpected. Relief. Maybe this time, Matteo had finally found someone. Then Sophia excused herself to take a phone call. Tony turned toward Matteo. Well? She doesn't like coffee. Tony blinked. You don't know that. She ordered tea. You're rejecting her because she drinks tea? No. Then why? Matteo looked directly at him. Because I spent the entire evening wondering what you're doing when you're not working. Tony's patience snapped. Do you hear yourself? Yes. You're not here to flirt with me. I know. You're here because you want a partner. Yeah. Then act like it. Matteo leaned back. Why does this bother you so much? Because I am good at my job. That isn't what I asked? Tony went quiet. Matteo's gaze softened. You're curious too. Tony scoffed. About what? Me. I am curious about all my clients. Do you think about all of them after work? Tony didn't answer. Because the honest answer was no. That night, Tony sat alone in his apartment with a glass of wine. He opened Matteo's file. 34. Alpha. MafiaBoss. No serious relationship in years. Extremely private. Highly controlled. And apparently determined to make Tony's life difficult. Tony closed the file. He opened it again. Then laughed quietly at himself. This is ridiculous. His phone buzzed. A message. Did Sophia impress you? Tony stared at it. He typed. She did. 3 dots appeared. Good. Tony waited. Another message arrived. Then why do I have the feeling you're disappointed? Tony's thumb hovered over the screen. He didn't reply. Across the city, Matteo waited. And for the first time, Tony had to admit something he hadn't wanted to consider. Maybe Matteo hadn't hired him because he wanted to find love. Maybe he had hired Tony because, from the moment they met, Tony was the only person he wanted to find. Tony Valdez should have known better than to bring Jake to a place where Matteo Ramirez could see him. But Tony wasn't thinking about Matteo that evening. At least, that's what he told himself. He was at a private rooftop lounge with Jake, who he had known casually for several months. Jake was charming, handsome, and uncomplicated, the exact kind of company Tony enjoyed when he didn't want anything serious. They were laughing over drinks when Tony noticed the atmosphere change. He looked toward the entrance. Matteo. Tony's stomach tightened. Matteo stood several feet away, surrounded by 2 members of his security team. His expression was calm. Too calm. Their eyes met. Jake followed Tony's gaze. Friend? Client. Jake raised an eyebrow. That's the famous one? Tony sighed. Apparently. Matteo walked toward them. Tony. His voice was perfectly polite. Tony knew him well enough now to recognize the tension beneath it. Matteo. What are you doing here? Meeting someone. His eyes moved to Jake. And you? Tony glanced at Jake. Enjoying my evening. Matteo's jaw tightened. Jake smiled and extended his hand. Jake. Matteo looked at the offered hand for a moment before taking it. Matteo. The handshake lasted barely a second. But Tony could feel the tension from across the table. Jake eventually excused himself to order another drink. The moment he was gone, Matteo looked at Tony. You're seeing him? Tony frowned. That's none of your business. I know. Then why ask? Matteo didn't answer. Tony folded his arms. You're jealous. No. Tony laughed. Matteo. The alpha looked away. That was answer enough. You can't be jealous, Tony said quietly. You're my client. I know. And I am allowed to have a life. I know. Then what exactly is your problem? Matteo looked back at him. You. Tony went still. Again. That word. Always that word. You keep saying that, Tony whispered. Because it's true. Matteo stepped closer. I tried to ignore it. Tony's heartbeat quickened. I thought if I let you find someone else, it would disappear. It didn't. The noise of the lounge seemed to fade around them. Matteo lowered his voice. I rejected every candidate because I couldn't imagine coming home to any of them. Tony swallowed. Why? Matteo looked directly into his eyes. Because I kept imagining you instead. Tony's breath caught. You're serious. I've never been more serious. Tony studied him. The powerful alpha who intimidated half the city was standing in front of him, looking almost uncertain. Not afraid. Just vulnerable. And suddenly Tony understood. The attraction he had been trying to dismiss wasn't one-sided. It had never been. He stepped closer. You should have told me. Matteo's eyes searched his face. Would you have listened? Tony smiled faintly. Probably not. A quiet laugh escaped Matteo. For the first time, Tony didn't see the mafia boss. He saw the man underneath. And he liked him. Much more than he should. Matteo, Tony said softly. Yes? I think you've just made my job very complicated. Matteo's eyes dropped briefly to his lips. Good. Tony smiled. Because I think I might finally know who your perfect match is. Matteo's expression changed. Who? Tony held his gaze. You already know. Either of them moved. Neither needed to. The answer was standing between them. Tony Valdez had spent most of his career telling people that attraction wasn't enough. Chemistry could be manufactured. Loneliness could be mistaken for love. And wanting someone didn't necessarily mean knowing how to love them. So when Matteo Ramirez asked him for a chance, Tony gave him one condition. One date. Matteo raised an eyebrow. One? One, Tony repeated. And you're not my client that night. What am I? Tony considered him. Someone trying to convince me. A slow smile appeared on Matteo's face. Then I will make it count. Matteo picked him up himself. No driver. Or security detail hovering nearby. Just Matteo, standing beside a black car in a dark coat, looking considerably less like the city's most feared alpha and considerably more like a man taking someone he cared about on a date. Tony stopped beside him. You're nervous. No. You are. Matteo opened the passenger door. Get in, Tony. Tony laughed softly. Bossy. You like it? Tony gave him a look before getting into the car. Don't get ahead of yourself. The date wasn't at an expensive restaurant. Matteo took him somewhere quiet instead, a private terrace overlooking the city, already prepared with dinner and a view of the lights below. Tony looked around. You did all this? I wanted somewhere we could talk. That answer caught him off guard. They ate slowly. They talked about everything except business. Tony learned that Matteo hated crowded parties, loved old movies, and couldn't cook anything more complicated than eggs. Matteo learned that Tony had once wanted to become an architect, that he hated being underestimated, and that he had a habit of working until 2 a.m. when something interested him. For the first time, Tony wasn't studying Matteo as a client. He was simply getting to know him. And he liked what he found. Later, they stood at the edge of the terrace. You're different tonight, Tony said. So are you. How? You're not looking at me like a problem you're trying to solve. Tony smiled. Maybe I don't think you're a problem anymore. Matteo turned toward him. Good. The silence between them changed. Tony felt it immediately. The space seemed smaller. Matteo stepped closer, but stopped before touching him. That restraint mattered. Can I kiss you? Tony looked into his eyes. You're asking? I want you to say yes. Tony's heart beat harder. Yes. Matteo leaned in slowly. Their lips met. The kiss was gentle at first, almost careful. Then Tony's fingers caught the front of Matteo's coat, holding him there as the kiss deepened. When they finally separated, either moved away. Tony looked at him, breathless and slightly amused. So, Matteo echoed. This definitely isn't matchmaking anymore. Matteo smiled. No. Tony rested his forehead briefly against his. Good. For once, neither of them needed to pretend. The client and the matchmaker were gone. There were only Tony and Matteo. After their first kiss, everything changed. Not dramatically. Small things. Matteo began texting Tony every morning. Tony started saving evenings for him. And somehow, the most powerful alpha in the city became the man who waited outside Tony's office with coffee because he knew Tony would forget to eat. They kept seeing each other privately. Tony liked it that way. For now. One evening, Matteo arrived at Tony's apartment after a particularly difficult day. Tony took one look at him and knew something was wrong. You're exhausted. Long day. Come here. Matteo did. He loosened his tie and sat on Tony's sofa, letting his shoulders finally drop. Tony sat beside him. You don't have to be Matteo Ramirez here. Matteo looked at him. What am I supposed to be? Just Matteo. Something softened in his expression. I don't know how to do that very well. You're learning. Tony reached for his hand. Matteo intertwined their fingers. For a man accustomed to controlling everything around him, he seemed remarkably comfortable letting Tony decide when to pull him closer, when to touch him, when simply to sit beside him in silence. Tony noticed. More importantly, he understood what it meant. Matteo wasn't surrendering because he was weak. He was surrendering because he trusted Tony. That realization settled somewhere deep inside him. You trust me, Tony said quietly. Matteo looked at their joined hands. With you, I don't feel like I have to control everything. Tony's chest tightened. He lifted Matteo's chin gently. You don't. Their eyes met. The familiar tension returned, stronger now. Neither of them pretended not to feel it. Matteo leaned closer. Tony met him halfway. Their kiss was slower this time, warmer, carrying all the things either man had yet found the courage to say. When they finally separated, Matteo rested his forehead against Tony's. I don't want this to be temporary. Tony's expression softened. Neither do I. The words seemed to surprise them both. For a moment neither spoke. Then Tony smiled. Stay. Matteo looked at him. Are you sure? Tony's fingers tightened around his. Yes. Tony led Matteo to the bedroom. The door shut behind them with a quiet click. Matteo's tie was already loose. Tony slid it free and let it drop with a soft smile. Listen to the full uncensored version on Patreon. Tony rested his forehead against Matteo's, a small smile still playing at his lips. No more pretending, he whispered. Matteo's hands slid up his back, holding him close. No more pretending. Somewhere between their first kiss and the third week of seeing each other, Matteo Ramirez stopped going home. It wasn't permanent. Often enough that Tony Valdez's apartment began to feel like a second home to him. His watch appeared on Tony's nightstand. His shirts occupied half a drawer. There was a pair of expensive shoes beside Tony's front door that Tony had nearly tripped over twice. You're taking over my apartment, Tony said one morning. Matteo, standing in the kitchen making coffee, glanced over his shoulder. You said I could stay. I said you could stay the night. You didn't specify how many nights. Tony stared at him. Matteo smiled. You're enjoying this. Maybe. That was the problem. Tony was. He had always guarded his independence carefully. His home was his sanctuary, his schedule was his own, and he had never liked anyone becoming too comfortable in his personal space. Yet Matteo had somehow slipped into his life without taking anything away from it. They had routines now. Tony worked late. Matteo waited. Tony forgot to eat. Matteo ordered dinner. Matteo came home exhausted. Tony knew exactly when to leave him alone and when to pull him close. It was strangely easy. And perhaps that was what frightened Tony most. One evening, Matteo arrived after midnight. Tony was sitting on the sofa reading when the front door opened. "You're late." "Meeting." Tony looked at him. "Bad one?" Matteo loosened his tie. "Very." Tony closed his book. "Come here." Matteo crossed the room without argument. He sat beside Tony and allowed himself to relax. Tony's hand resting over his. "You don't have to be strong every second," Tony murmured. Matteo looked at him. "I know." "Do you?" "With you." That answer made Tony's chest tighten. Matteo had spent his entire life being the person everyone obeyed. Yet with Tony, he didn't need to be. He could simply exist. Tony leaned closer. Matteo met him halfway. The kiss was slow and familiar, carrying the quiet intimacy they had built over the past few weeks. When they separated, Matteo rested his forehead against Tony's. "I like this." "What?" "This." Tony smiled. "Very descriptive." Matteo laughed softly. "Coming home to you." Tony's expression softened. "You're getting sentimental." "Only with you." The room fell quiet. Matteo had spent his entire life being the person everyone obeyed. Yet with Tony, he didn't need to be. He could simply exist. Tony reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. "You look exhausted." "I am, baby." "Then let me take care of you tonight." Matteo's eyes softened. "You don't have to." "I know." Tony stood and held out his hand. "Come on." "Where?" Tony's mouth curved into a small smile. "I'm running you a bath." For a moment, Matteo simply looked at him. Then he took Tony's hand. "Only a bath?" Tony laughed softly. "That depends on how well you behave." Matteo's smile was slow and unmistakably warm. For once, he followed Tony without asking where they were going. The door to the bathroom closed behind them, leaving the rest of the world on the other side. Tony turned on the taps, adjusting the temperature until steam began to rise. He poured a measure of bath oil into the water, something warm and clean that he knew Matteo liked, and watched the surface turn faintly cloudy. Matteo leaned against the counter, watching him with that half-lidded, exhausted look that always made Tony's chest tighten. "You're really doing this," Matteo said. "I said I would. I can wash myself, you know." Tony glanced over his shoulder, mouth curving. "I know. I'm choosing not to let you." Matteo's laugh was quiet. "Bossy. You like it?" "Unfortunately." Tony tested the water with his wrist, then turned off the taps. He stepped closer, listened to the full uncensored version on Patreon. Tony rested their foreheads together. "Still just a bath?" he asked, voice quiet. Matteo's mouth curved. "I will allow the upgrade." Tony smiled. Outside the bathroom, the apartment waited, quiet, familiar, already half-shared. By morning, neither of them would be able to pretend this was casual anymore. Matteo wasn't simply spending nights at Tony's apartment. He was building a life around the person who had somehow become home. The problem with loving someone powerful was that sometimes you forgot they didn't need saving. Matteo Ramirez learned that lesson on a Tuesday morning. Tony knew something was wrong the moment he walked into his office and found two unfamiliar men standing outside his door. He stopped. "Who are they?" His assistant looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Ramirez sent them." Tony's expression changed. "Excuse me?" Before anyone could answer, his phone rang. "Matteo." Tony answered immediately. "What did you do?" "Good morning to you too. Why are there two armed men outside my office?" "Protection." "I don't need protection." "You do now." Tony's jaw tightened. Matteo. There was an incident last night. Someone connected to one of my rivals was asking questions about you. Tony went silent for half a second. Then his anger returned. And your solution was to put guards outside my office without telling me? I wasn't going to take chances. You weren't going to take chances? Tony stood from his desk. You made a decision about my life without asking me. I was protecting you. No. You were controlling the situation because you were afraid. Silence. Matteo's voice lowered. I wasn't going to let anything happen to you. And I appreciate that. Tony's voice was calm now, which somehow made it sharper. But you don't get to decide what happens to me. Tony. No. He hung up. Matteo arrived 20 minutes later. Tony was waiting. The moment Matteo entered the office, Tony pointed toward the door. Tell them to leave. Matteo hesitated. Tony. Now. The Alpha studied him. Then he nodded. A phone call later, the guards disappeared. Tony folded his arms. You don't get to do that again. I can't promise that. Tony's eyes hardened. Then we have a problem. Matteo stepped closer. I was scared. That stopped him. Tony hadn't expected that answer. Matteo's expression was unusually open. When I heard someone had been asking about you, I didn't think. I reacted. You reacted by taking control. Yes. And that's exactly what I want, except. Matteo looked away. Tony softened slightly, but didn't retreat. I know you're powerful. I know you are too. Then trust me to decide when I need help. Matteo was quiet. Tony continued. You don't love me because I'm someone you can protect. His voice dropped. You love me because I'm me. Matteo looked back at him. The words landed. He finally understood that Tony wasn't rejecting his care. He was rejecting the idea that love gave Matteo authority over him. I was wrong, Matteo said. Tony blinked. Matteo stepped closer. I should have asked you. Yes. I should have trusted you, and I shouldn't have treated your strength like something I needed to manage. Tony's anger slowly faded. That's all I wanted you to understand. Matteo reached for his hand but stopped before touching him. Can I? Tony looked at him. Then placed his hand in Matteo's. You know you don't have to ask. Their fingers intertwined. Matteo brought his hand to his lips. I love you. Tony's expression softened. I know. A small smile appeared. Say it anyway. Tony laughed quietly. I love you too. And this time, Matteo understood the difference between protecting the man he loved and respecting him. He didn't need to stand in front of Tony. He only needed to stand beside him. A week later, Matteo brought Tony to dinner with the people closest to him. Tony expected questions. He expected suspicion. He expected someone to wonder what an Enigma was doing beside the city's most powerful alpha. Instead, Matteo simply walked into the room with Tony beside him. This is Tony. One of Matteo's oldest friends smiled. The matchmaker? Matteo glanced at Tony. The man I love. Tony's heart skipped. No explanation. No attempt to define Tony by his status. Only the truth. The room went quiet for a moment. Then someone smiled. Well. Matteo squeezed Tony's hand beneath the table. Now you know. Tony looked at him. And for the first time, their relationship wasn't something hidden behind closed doors or disguised as business. They had chosen each other. Not because they needed each other. Because they wanted each other. And somehow, that made all the difference. For the first time since they had met, Tony Valdez wasn't thinking about what came next for his client. He was no client anymore. He was only Matteo. They sat together on Tony's balcony late one evening, the city glowing beneath them. Matteo had one arm resting along the back of Tony's chair, their shoulders touching. It was quiet. Comfortable. Until Matteo broke the silence. My mother called. Tony glanced at him. That sounds ominous. It was. Tony smiled. What did she want? To know when I am getting married. Tony laughed. Of course. Matteo looked out over the city. She also asked about children. Tony's smile faded slightly. And what did you tell her? That she should mind her own business. Tony laughed again. Very romantic. I thought so. They fell quiet. But this time, the subject didn't disappear. Tony turned toward him. Do you want children? Matteo didn't answer immediately. I don't know. Tony nodded. That's honest. I've never really had the luxury of imagining a normal future. Tony studied him. What would your future look like if nobody else got to decide? Matteo looked at him. Something quieter. Quieter? A home that feels like ours. Someone waiting for me when I come back. Maybe children. Tony's expression softened. Maybe? Matteo smiled. I am negotiating. Tony nudged his shoulder. You're terrible. I've been told. Tony looked down at their intertwined hands. I think I would want a family. Matteo's thumb brushed over his knuckles. Even with everything that comes with it? Not because of expectations. Tony looked at him. If I ever have children, I want it because we decided together. Not because someone thinks an alpha and an enigma are supposed to produce an heir. Matteo's expression became serious. Agreed. And marriage? Matteo smiled. You're asking me? I am asking what you want. I want you. Tony's heart skipped. That wasn't the question. It was my answer. Tony laughed softly. Matteo leaned closer. I don't care about the ceremony. I don't care about the name on the invitation. If I ever marry you, it's because I want to wake up beside you for the rest of my life. Tony's teasing expression disappeared. That sounds dangerously romantic. I've been spending too much time with you. Tony kissed him. Slowly. There was no urgency, only the warmth of two people beginning to imagine something larger than the present. When they separated, Matteo rested his forehead against Tony's. Someday, he whispered. Tony smiled. Someday. Their kiss deepened. Tony's fingers curled into Matteo's shirt as Matteo drew him closer. The conversation about tomorrow gradually gave way to the quiet intimacy of tonight. Listen to the full uncensored version on Patreon. Matteo pulled him close, pressing one last lingering kiss to his forehead, then his lips. Tony's voice was quiet, almost amused. Still thinking? Matteo's arm tightened around him. Right now I'm thinking about tonight. Good answer. They lay tangled together in the quiet of the apartment, the conversation about marriage and children still warm between them, but for the moment, the only future that mattered was the one they were already building, one unhurried night at a time. 6 months later, Tony Valdez was still a matchmaker. His office remained exactly as it had always been, warm lighting, expensive furniture, shelves filled with carefully organized files, and a waiting list long enough to keep him busy for years. His clients still wanted the impossible. Wealthy alphas wanted partners who weren't intimidated by them. Influential enigmas wanted someone who could keep up. People arrived convinced they needed a certain type of person and left after Tony patiently dismantled everything they thought they knew about love. The only thing that had changed was the man waiting for him outside. Matteo Ramirez leaned against the hallway wall, dressed in a dark suit, scrolling through his phone while Tony finished his final consultation. He was still one of the most powerful men in the city. Tony was still completely unimpressed by that fact. When the office door finally opened, Matteo looked up. Finished? For today. Good. Tony grabbed his coat. You've been waiting for 2 hours. I've had worse meetings. You could have gone home. I could have. Tony smiled. But you didn't. No. Matteo held out his hand. Tony took it. They walked down the hallway together. Their lives hadn't become smaller because of their relationship. Tony still had his business. Matteo still had his empire. Tony still traveled, worked late, disappeared into his office for hours, and refused to be treated like anyone's possession. Matteo still commanded rooms without raising his voice. They simply made space for each other. And somehow, that had been enough. That evening, Matteo brought Tony to the rooftop where they had shared one of their first real dates. The city stretched beneath them. Tony looked around. "You're suspiciously quiet." Matteo smiled. "I am thinking. Dangerous. I have something for you." Tony raised an eyebrow. Matteo reached into his coat and pulled out a small velvet box. Tony froze. "Matteo. Open it." Inside was a ring. Simple. Elegant. Nothing extravagant. Tony looked at him. "Is this a promise?" Tony's expression softened. "Not an ultimatum or a demand," Matteo continued. "I'm not asking you to become someone else or give anything up." He took Tony's hand. "I just want you to know that when I imagine my future, you're in it." Tony looked at the ring again. Then at Matteo. "You really know how to make a man speechless." "I've been practicing." Tony laughed. Then he held out his hand. Matteo slipped the ring onto his finger. Tony looked at it for a long moment. "I will take your promise." Matteo smiled. "That's all I wanted." The following week, a new client sat across from Tony. She looked nervous. "I don't know what I'm doing wrong," she admitted. "How do you know when someone is actually right for you?" Tony smiled. For once, he didn't immediately reach for his notes. Through the glass wall of his office, he could see Matteo waiting outside. Their eyes met. Matteo smiled. Tony turned back to his client. "Finding someone who loves you without needing to change you." The client considered his answer. "And that's enough?" Tony looked toward the man waiting for him. "For the right person?" He smiled. "It's everything." When the appointment ended, Tony gathered his things and stepped outside. Matteo reached for his hand. Tony looked down at the ring on his finger. The city's most sought-after matchmaker had spent years believing his greatest talent was finding the right people for each other. But love had taught him something unexpected. Sometimes the best match wasn't the one you planned. It was the one you never saw coming. The one who challenged you. The one who respected your strength. The one who stayed without asking you to become smaller. Tony squeezed Matteo's hand. His greatest match had never been one of his clients. It had been the man waiting outside his office. His exception. His person. His home.
Love Tony and Matteo? The Patreon edition includes bonus scenes, an extended epilogue, and the full uncensored romance. Join Patreon to experience the complete story. Thanks for watching. If you're hooked and want more, join me on Patreon and instantly unlock 57 exclusive stories, including 22 After Dark stories you can't read anywhere else, Patreon exclusive endings, early access to new uploads, and archived stories that are no longer on YouTube. New stories are added regularly, so there's always something waiting for you. The link is in the description. See you in the next upload. If you can wait.